oftentimes I find that online people talk about the brand behind Sabrina Carpenter or the marketing strategies of Taylor Swift. And people love to educate about the marketing and the branding behind idols. I think they don't educate as much about the values and the psychology behind these people and what they personally stand for, which I think for the fandom, that is the much more important part. The marketing is how you find the correct audience, and the values is how you maintain them. Unfortunately, though fans unintentionally but yet actively create spaces that foster their own values, it often takes the actual star a while to catch on to the values that they kind of accidentally promoted. This lack of focusing on values is sad in my opinion because these people do hold a lot of power, and therefore they should treat their fans not just as a marketable audience but also as individuals who find a certain need to be fulfilled within their star. So it's no surprise that fandoms exist and that they could replace a religion because religion is a code of ethics, a code of morals, and these stars, through their branding, also create values that people are willing to look up to. Hi there, and welcome to the Mugcast, a cozy listen to pair with your coffee. I'm Hannah, the Austrian version of Carrie Bradshaw, living in Taiwan. I write articles on Medium where I cover everything from music to psychology as a woman living abroad, and I share tidbits of my life on Threads and on Instagram. Here on the podcast, I read my stories aloud with a few fresh reflections and insights along the way, so grab your mug, settle in, and let's get into today's piece. It is again one of those days where it's 5 a.m. in the morning as I'm recording this so I can avoid any sounds in the background. But it's okay because I have a really good topic at my fingertips. Recently, I've been reflecting a lot about not just GenZ's spirituality, which is something I've already talked about, but how music is kind of an intersection for religion or almost like a religious replacement sometimes. And I know this can get so excessive, and I know that everybody talking about parasocial relationships usually talks about the extreme kind. But honestly, after becoming part of many of these fandoms, I haven't found myself turn into the most cringy, useless human ever. As a matter of fact, many times when I enter a fandom, I become better through it in a way where I achieve things in my life that I never thought were possible. I do things that I would previously not have reached for, or I just act according to a moral code that I previously couldn't put into words, but because of this artist, I can now pinpoint the emotions that I'm talking about. So today I want to talk about specifically that. I know that there's a lot of problems with hyper fans, but I think the majority of people in a fandom are usually not the crazy kind. Usually the majority of people are normal people like you and me who just enjoy the music and enjoy the lessons that these idols or stars or whatever have to share. And for me, that's specifically recent because I joined the BTS fandom a couple months ago. Ever since then, I will say I've become a better person. Seriously. And specifically, I was inspired by this one post that was calling on ARMY to kind of tell their jobs and to tell the story about how they met BTS. And a lot of these stories were so inspiring and so beautiful. It reminded me of last year when I became a Swiftie or an intern Swiftie and learned a lot about the Taylor Swift universe. I also had the same feeling that a lot of Swifties were very genuine, very caring, very loving and kind people, and they were just being ostracized by our society. And this, I think, is the funny thing about fandoms these days is they build bubbles in the online community where they're very kind and friendly amongst each other, and they learn from each other and they take the best that they can from their idols. But at the same time, the rest of the society kind of views them like these crazy people just for liking a person, just for liking a musician. So I think the same thing happens to Swifties, the same thing happens to ARMY, BTS ARMY. It sure as hell definitely also happens to people who are in the Sabrina Carpenter fandom, which is one that I'm in for a long time now. I'm a huge Sabrina Carpenter fan, and I love her artistry. But since maybe because she doesn't have a name for her fandom, it's kind of harder to find that bubble. Whereas for BTS, you literally type in ARMY and everybody assembles. It's like a minion army that just appears out of nowhere, which is so nice because it's such a huge social driver. Like, I've met so many people who are so genuinely kind online through BTS. And I'm now going to go to a concert viewing at my local theater nearby, at my local cinema. And now, mind you, I'm living in Taiwan, right? I'm not a native speaker of this language. I will likely have trouble understanding stuff as it's going on. But I can be sure that when I enter that venue, there's going to be other people who are agreeing with me on the same types of views, on the same types of backgrounds, and on the same moral code, and thus we will be able to get along. This podcast episode is based on an article that's called The New Gen Z Religion, Why I Worship Pop Stars. As always, the link for the original article is down below. You can just click the link to the article and then you can highlight things within if you have something that you want to take notes on. Also, you can read the article for yourself if there's some parts that you find interesting. My ideal scenario for the podcast is not for this to be a video format, obviously, but I would like it to be like a read along or an accompaniment to your morning commute to work. You can read the article or you can choose not to. If you would like a quicker and AI voice version of this podcast, you can also listen to the article in the link below. So the link below is your one-stop for all the things, all the images, all the links that I will be mentioning. Let's get started. The New Gen Z Religion, Why I Worship Pop Stars. Parasocial relationships, how escapism and a lack of spirituality turn fandom into a modern religion. As the return of BTS took the world by storm, I was sucked into the fandom like a feather into a fucking Dyson. I've been inside this vacuum for weeks now, and it appears that no one empties this dirtbag out. I even told people online that I was stuck in the ARMY vacuum, but people only welcomed me in with lots of purple hearts. They kind of talked about having a refuge and reassured me that there was no point in me getting out of here. But they also added that you don't leave ARMY, you just become a better person. At first, I seriously laughed at that. And then 2 weeks passed, and then 3 weeks passed, and then a month, and then a second. And then I realized, shit, there really is no way out of here. But am I a better person now? Are we all just delusional children? As this sank in, I discovered something startling. I think I really don't want to get out of this ARMY vacuum. At first, I was scared I had finally ended up in the delulu that my Gen Z heritage assigns me to. I feared I'd finally fallen victim to escapism. But if I look at the past weeks, it is striking how happy I became. And not in a delusional sense. I laughed, even alone in my room. I was sick. But I didn't feel creeping loneliness that was hovering in the corner of my expat life single room, which is something that usually happens when I get sick. I made friends, online maybe, but ones that I met in real life after. And they laughed at my jokes and they followed me around. And it made me feel heard and understood in a way that eldest daughters honestly rarely feel understood. And call me crazy, but I actually think I did become a better person. I became a better person for myself. I give myself grace more easily these days, but I'm also more easily motivated to work on things. I've achieved and done things in the past 2 weeks that I would have never dreamed possible before, and I can't help but wonder if I had done those same things if I had never become ARMY. And before you rage comment telling me that I've simply become an escapist delulu, like a Gen Z delulu person, let me dive into the nature of parasocial relationships and the pitfalls of them. Because in my opinion, Western culture overuses the concept of childish behavior, especially among men, and parasocial relationships fall into this category of childish behavior. I took the time last summer to Swiftify myself, which, by the way, I became an intern Swiftie last summer, and I also have an article, actually several articles, and a podcast episode on that in case you're curious. So, me becoming ARMY is far from the first time that I'm engaging in a parasocial relationship. Maybe because I grew up in the digital era, like any Gen Z, parasocial relations and strong immersions are always kind of a part of my daily lived world. But I realized that parasocial relations aren't all bad. The defining criterion is whether one is able to use them to one's advantage. And at this point, I quickly want to mention one parasocial relationship that I had as a kid that's probably different from what you expect, which is Pokemon. I was a huge Pokemon fan as a kid, to the extent where I really imagined this world to be true. I spent a lot of time figuring out the Pokemon maps. So I was so deep in the Pokemon fandom that it really inspired my creativity. Actually, a lot of my drawing practice when I was a kid came from imitating Pokemon. Like I had this big map with, I think, 423 first 4 generations of Pokemon on there. And I would just draw all of these Pokemon. And if I compare like the first time I did a drawing of a Pokemon and the last time that I did it, my drawing abilities increased insanely. I'm not saying I'm a good artist these days because I jumped off the wagon, but what Pokemon instilled in me was a general curiosity into diving deeper into topics. I also remember there was a fan group around Pokemon that I could engage with. So there was a social group connected to it. And then there was the whole other thing, which was Pokemon was my entry point to learning Japanese later in my life. It was the entry point for me to later on literally moving abroad to Taiwan. Had I not played Pokemon as a kid and become obsessed with Pokemon, I can't firmly say I would be sitting in Taiwan today. So, like, this was also a delusional fandom, but in the end, it led me to some of the greatest choices of my entire life. Using parasocial relationships right is the important part. Like I already pointed out in my article on the psychology of Taylor Swift, which I mentioned before, and it's also a podcast episode, the famous object of parasocial relationships is basically a strongly engaged role model that drives you forward. The difficulty here is to differentiate what you get from that star. If a famous person becomes the source of your happiness, not drive, you might actually lose your shit when they stop delivering that entertainment. That is toxic and a clear sign of a dependency rather than a role model. And that's the difference, right? A parasocial relationship basically is a role model. Having a role model in somebody who's famous, somebody who you cannot reach. That's why it's parasocial. It's like on a separate level from your regular social relations. It's apart from real life. It becomes difficult when this role model that you've created or that role model that created itself that you are reaching up to is something that you become dependent upon for your happiness. A role model should drive you, but not be the sole purpose of your life, fundamentally. I've seen that in many of my K-pop loving roommates in my time in Korea last year. And I think that's the reason why so many people are so sensitive around K-pop is because they only see the crazy people and not the normal people. But I have seen crazy people. I will not neglect that they exist. So my K-pop loving roommates, they would invest their entire salary in merchandise. They would return from concerts either in happy tears or in roaring fucking anger. And they would say things like, the group didn't deliver. And they would find themselves utterly destroyed for days on end when a famous member went to the military. Like I clearly remember this one girl, she went to several concerts of the same band. She went to Incheon, which is quite a ride from where we were living, a couple occasions just to catch idols at the airport. She had not one, not two of the light sticks, but I think 4. She introduced me to all of her different light sticks and how it was so important to her that she had all of them because they had certain features. And I get you can buy whatever the hell you want to, but she didn't do anything besides that. That was the point. She was in Korea for that. And I remember her coming back from one concert and she was so angry. She was like, they didn't deliver today. I paid for these tickets and they didn't even do that move that they're famous for. And they didn't do the other move that they were famous for. And I was like, wow, these poor idols. Look at that girl. She's spending so much time and money on them and then rages on them. These poor men also get lashed by her so badly for just not performing some dance moves. Get your shit together, girl. And then the other thing was that one day she came home crying and I was like, what's happening? And she's like, one of them went to the military. And I'm like, oh, okay. So it's like the BTS situation where they're all gone for a couple of years. And she was like, no, they're still performing. But now there's one person less on stage. I'm like, you fucking kidding me, bitch? You can still go to those concerts and look at the same people. I get there's an emotional tie, but to the extent where you have to cry for days, I think that's too much. That's where this idol is dominating your happiness in life and ruling over your emotions in a way that they never intended, by the way. But the thing is, that is not the only possible parasocial relationship, and also not even the most common one, but rather it is the one that is most represented under the term parasocial relationship. Like most things in life, parasocial relationships exist on a spectrum. While my roommate was clearly showing signs of escapism and obsession, many ARMY that I find online use BTS more as a source of drive, like a crutch that you can lean on when things get a little bit too harsh in life. And you'd be surprised by the number of fans who write stories of the time that BTS helped me in my life, which to many that sounds obsessive, but it's actually usually just a genuine story of a really kind human who wants nothing more than to say thank you. It doesn't mean you give your personal agency over your life to an idol, but rather it means that you needed them at some point, and now this experience of having needed them fosters your connection towards them, which fosters your personal drive in life. Every time I listen to Miley Cyrus's Liberty Walk or Party in the USA, anything of that like early Miley Cyrus era, I am reminded of the little teenager that I was, and it reminds me of how far I've come. So sue me, but I'm thankful for Miley Cyrus for giving that era of my life a background track. And if I listen to it now, I get nostalgia and I feel for that girl that I was many, many years ago. And I will not apologize for being grateful to an artist for what she's inspired in me. I don't know why Liberty Walk specifically hit a chord with me, but that song, for some reason, I remember dancing it in my room when I was little, or like more or less little in my teens, I guess. And for some reason, I felt like my life was a Liberty Walk. Hell, it was. It was just going to become a Liberty Walk later. Such things, like what I just mentioned, in psychology are referred to as transitional objects. Traditionally, a transitional object could be something like a teddy bear. A child carries that teddy bear to get over the sadness when the child is separated from its parents. But there are also more adult transitional objects. The more mature the human, the more immaterial the object. And thus religion, creativity, or other intangibles can aid grown humans, adults, as transitional objects to overcome hardships. They serve like a psychological crutch, like a mechanism to maintain a regular schedule through some sorts of difficulties. Or they can be an automatic mechanism to feel less alone when there are issues. My generation, Gen Z, grew up in a globalized society that questions and challenges religion. But it rediscovers that humans have a need for spirituality among digital media influences. And thus personified transitional objects are often pop stars that market themselves readily to us. It's no surprise that pop stars become a religion because their art, their music, thrives off emotions. Positive effects of parasocial relationships. Religion or parasocial relationships are transitional spaces that help humans naturally regulate their emotions. It helps us explore our identities, and it adds a meta level of symbolic meaning that goes beyond one's existence. Since moving to Asia, where religions like Taoism are philosophies and religions at the same time, or where Confucius founded a philosophy of education that structures society alongside temples, it has become clear to me how religions are effectively a code of ethics that a society adheres to. And this learning cemented itself when I recently made friends with a Jehovah's Witness. Initially, I had no interest in this sort of religious conversation because I seek my ethical code somewhere else. But I couldn't suppress the thought that life for this new friend of mine seemed fundamentally easier. She had met her boyfriend and later husband at church. She mentioned something interesting to me because she said it was freeing to not need to clear topics such as open relationships, the boundaries of relationships, the timeline of the relationship, all of that. She didn't have to clarify the boundaries of their physical interactions because they both were reading the Bible, and all of these small details that as a Gen Z usually you have to communicate with your partner, those weren't necessary to be communicated because they had the same ethical code that they both adhered to, which kind of made becoming a couple much easier for her. She said that since things were written in the Bible, many conversations about basic topics were just not necessary, and I will admit that a part of me envied her for that simplicity. She's also arrived in Taiwan, a completely foreign country to her with no job, no Mandarin skills, and not even a university to study at. Like, there was no connection, no group that she connected to. And yet, because of her community at church, she immediately had her own personally fitted network that shared her values. And as someone who continues to build such a community by myself, I was really surprised to hear this. Religion, just like parasocial relations and other transitional objects, can be practiced safely in the form of a necessary, non-toxic sort of escapism. And I know escapism these days is a very negative term, but hear me out. This doesn't mean to detach from reality, but it means to foster an alternate space for yourself that is filled with things that are bigger than us. This can range from religion to philosophy, creativity, or art, or it can be your pop star. Which transitional space is available to you depends on your cultural background. While some cultures still foster religion amongst younger generations, in other cultures it's not as common. So there now is a vacuum for spirituality where religion once was. This gives engagement with the arts and also alternates spirituality a chance to thrive. This gives engagement with arts and also alternative spirituality a chance to thrive, as we saw it in the early 2020s with the rise of tarot cards. Of course, it becomes dangerous when idols become gods, but a normally mentally capable young person in the 21st century can typically differentiate between a god figure and a human idol, even if the extreme cases are those that appear in the media. Fundamentally, our society is more interested in crazy outliers than the norm. So for most fans, an idol fulfills 4 roles. The first one is they serve as a role model, whose path to success is reverse engineerable, and their dedication is admirable, and you can imitate them to a certain extent. The second role is they become emotional anchors in a society that is increasingly suffering from loneliness. Also, we have a society where there's a multitude of different life paths that we may be leading. And so we struggle for the consistency that an artist can give us emotionally. Besides that, role number 3 is they can serve as an identity checkpoint, where one can see themselves reflected in another person or watch themselves become a better version of yourself. The different stages of Miley Cyrus also remind me of different stages of myself. So she's almost like an identity checkpoint for me. And the fourth role is, ideally, assuming that the idol has a well-established moral compass, they can become like a moral North Star. And all of these points foster emotional and psychological growth that is self-motivated, and it's genuine. The misunderstandings in fandoms. If you're not part of a fandom yourself, all of these descriptions might still sound fishy to you. Mainly because, as mentioned earlier, only the extreme cases are shown on the media. On top of that, the blurred boundaries between famous people and their followers can look threatening from an outside perspective. The intensity looks irrational, and is often only until you enter a fandom that you realize that these communities feed on one of the most basic human resources, which is human connection. As with a religion where people go to services to meet each other, fandoms at their roots are areas of connection. This is why when you become a part of ARMY, you will find yourself in the same physical and digital spaces as like-minded people. And eventually, you share deep things with them based on previously agreed upon, often invisible, codes of ethics that exist within the fandom. This invisible code of ethics is constructed by the idols themselves, sometimes more and sometimes less on purpose. For instance, the BTS ARMY has a strong focus on mental health and on emotional growth, and they make that very obvious, and they don't only market that, but they also even go to the UN for that. The Swiftie community, on the other hand, celebrates all stages of womanhood and love. Swifties can often, like me with Miley Cyrus, trace their own growth through the different Swiftie eras. And Sabrina Carpenter fans often value radical femininity, sometimes feminism. I personally am part of that. Ironically, the brand that these idols create to market themselves become the basis for the values that their fandom upholds. And yet, I think this process seems secondary and is sometimes silenced in comparison to marketing. Oftentimes, I find that online people talk about the brand behind Sabrina Carpenter, or the marketing strategies of Taylor Swift. And people love to educate about the marketing and the branding behind idols. I think they don't educate as much about the values and the psychology behind these people and what they personally stand for, which I think for the fandom, that is the much more important part. The marketing is how you find the correct audience, and the values is how you maintain them. This lack of focusing on values is sad in my opinion because these people do hold a lot of power, and therefore they should treat their fans not just as a marketable audience, but also as individuals who find a certain need to be fulfilled within their star. This is, I think, why stories of idols abusing their fandom haunt keywords such as parasocial relationships. Because unfortunately, though fans unintentionally but yet actively create spaces that foster their own values, it often takes the actual star a while to catch on to the values that they kind of accidentally promoted. Even though the stars themselves strongly believe in them, sometimes they're unaware of how they've embedded those same values in their fandom. I think for BTS it's very clear, they're very aware of the values that they embedded in ARMY. I think for Sabrina Carpenter at the moment, for instance, I'm not sure she knows exactly the values that she's instilling in her community. I don't know if Sabrina knows how many like-minded women her fandom includes that are all thinking along the same lines as her, because she creates music that mixes femininity and feminism into one pot. And so she's creating a fandom of women who believe in the coexistence of femininity and feminism. I'm not sure if she's really 100% aware that she instilled and carried those values into her fandom. It's funny because the stars will still invest time in finding a niche, and we all talk about creating a marketable brand online. But what underlies the idea is that craving of a certain part of a society. It's a certain part of society that lacks a set of values that they can agree upon. And suddenly there's this one person who, more or less accidentally, provides these exact values through their branding. So it's no surprise that fandoms exist and that they could replace a religion, because religion is a code of ethics, a code of morals. And these stars, through their branding, also create values that people are willing to look up to. The real question is not, are parasocial relationships good or bad? The tricky part is, how does one use the parasocial relations advantageously and safely, especially on the idol side? The relationship can serve as a tool for growth, as a transitional space. It can be healthy and necessary as an escape into today's much needed spirituality. The relations can serve as a tool for growth. They can be transitional spaces. They're healthy and they're necessary escapes in a world where we really need spirituality. Or they can help you form an identity and human connection through a joint moral compass. The truth is that most members of a fandom don't enter parasocial relationships because they want to look more fashionable through a certain brand or because they want to buy certain LPs. Most people in a fandom have an unsatisfied and often unnoticed need for a moral compass, for an ethical code that is so often lacking in the 21st century, where our society is continuously becoming more and more diverse and complex. We live in a time where spirituality often lies in ruins, and it has become a choice, fortunately, whether one engages with religions or not, or seeks their spirituality otherwise, individually. Or some seek a sense of moreness in creativity and in the arts, and all of those are great. Be it music, acting, or visual arts, parasocial relations are far more than obsessions. They are modern spaces that define morals and values in a world that is yet to be built, like a code of conduct for the modern Gen Z knight in shining armor. Thanks for granting me access to your ears on the Mugcast. You can read more of my writing on Medium under Hannah's Cafe or Hug in a Mug, or you can follow me on Instagram and Threads at hugin.amug for cozy content and updates. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow the podcast, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and share it with a fellow coffee lover and let me know in the comments which article I should read next. I hope you had a nice cappuccino with this episode, and I'm sending a warm hug from my mug to yours. Hope to see you soon, somewhere on Hannah's Cafe. Bye bye.